I'm here with physiotherapist and ADCC competitor Livia Giles and strength and conditioning coach Ben King, discussing strength conditioning for Jiu Jitsu. In the last video, we answered questions sent to us on Instagram with a specific focus on the recreational athlete. Now we're going to jump right back into the discussion and continue where we left off. So Ben, another key question that came up time and time again, in fact something I think is really important, is that we've talked about the fact that people are they're doing Jiu Jitsu and they want to start doing strength and conditioning or something like that. They're doing it because they want to help their Jiu Jitsu, right? And that's quite different, as I talked about before, from just working out just to stay in shape or to have a good looking body or whatever it is. So how specific do they need to get in their strength conditioning in order to improve their performance in Jiu Jitsu? Is there stuff that's specifically important to do that will help your Jiu Jitsu more and therefore it is more specific? So is there strength training for Jiu Jitsu that becomes important if you're a recreational athlete?
I think, yes, you should be considering the specificity for your sport if that's your goal, and it connects back to what you're intending to do with your either career or with your training, and it reflects back to who you are as an individual and what the demands are of the sport. I would just be careful. This is an area where I think people can be not as considered, and it's easy to think you're being specific, but I think we always have to obey the laws of physiology and of the human body. So when you're being specific, it may not necessarily be replicating the movements and abilities that you see in Jiu-Jitsu. So, passing guard or doing something, athletic with a band around your waist in the active skill. I don't think that's the best spend of your energy. Perhaps, if you work on the skill itself and the physical quality itself, then you'll be able to enact that in the actual skill. So I think there's certainly a time and place for specific exercises, but if they come at the cost of more general physical underpinning developments, that's where people can be led astray. So a useful model by Yuri Verkhoshansky, like kind of one of the forefathers or, Mount Rushmore of S&C and sports science, is the concept of dynamic correspondence. And it's gives you a lens to look at a specific movement or demand of the sport and then start to think about the physical qualities that underpin that. So put simply, it's a regime of muscular works. What contraction types are they feeling? And given Jiu-Jitsu, they'll often be isometric, so still and stiff positions. What are the range of motions being felt by different joints? What are the muscle groups involved in those different joints? What is the magnitude of force and effort? And then in what range do you need to be really powerful in? So that gives you a scope to look across. And this obviously comes from, track and field backgrounds and, other sports. But I still think you can apply that model to Jiu-Jitsu and then get a better understanding of where and how you can overload. Particularly when viewing the muscles that get worked and what range of motion they get worked in. If you get strong in those positions and then let the skill take care of itself, in essence, lifting is a skill in and of itself. There's technique that goes into that. There's ability that goes into that, just as there is in Jiu-Jitsu. So when you start to make that skill, when you get really, really fancy with your skill, it's hard to develop the physical underpinning. It's a motor neuron. It's a motor skill, I should say. And it's executing in a specific context. You're reacting to your partner. There's a lot of things going on that go into that performance. So in terms of getting specific with that stuff, I wouldn't be kind of delving into that world, but you can be specific for the sport by following the laws I've just listed. And if we go back to earlier in the podcast where I talk about the muscle groups that are involved, that's when you can get strength training for Jiu-Jitsu. But it's obviously relevant to the athlete and the demands of the sport. The second thing I would point out is there's different times, different times for different things. So if you're just outside of a competition, maybe your training looks very specific. You're only doing a couple little things, but for every increase or every degree of increase in specificity, you're going to reduce the ability to overload. So, maybe just after competition, you don't have another competition for another 9 months. That's when you can go super general. Your training will look very different to what it is that you're competing. Maybe you're working on something, a skill that you haven't learnt yet, or maybe you're delving more into wrestling or other areas of combat. That's when you can be more general in your training. But if you're just outside of competition, that's where you might be, very specific. And, as we go through the programs later with Liv, we will see that as we get closer and closer to comp, we had to make allowances for more specific training, which was going to see a more short-term result. But certainly, yeah, to put it simply, you don't have to get super specific. You can use the basics and do them really, really well for a really long time. But there are times that you can tilt S&C towards being more specific jiu-jitsu. What do you think, Liv?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think we need to definitely reiterate that specificity doesn't mean like putting a weight vest on and doing jiu-jitsu drills. That's not necessarily, or it will probably make you stronger, but it's not necessarily the best use of your time. I think you have to keep coming back to what your goals are and how to achieve those goals, and then it becomes pretty clear. So where we have to get specific is knowing what ranges we're working in. Like, for example, we can do hamstring rehab, or really common in ACL. We have to keep the hamstring really, really strong. And the way I prescribe exercises for my patients might be a little bit different to if you're a runner to a jiu-jitsu athlete. With jiu-jitsu, you might have to get very specific in the ranges you're trying to get better, and that might be in the later stage of rehab. We tend to use our hamstrings in that inner range, so actually getting on the hamstring curl and curling it all the way in, which a lot of people in the mainstream fitness industry say is completely non-functional. But if you're a football player, or if you're, a long distance runner, you probably are going to be working those outer ranges. So I think specificity and how specific you get to training, it really depends what you're trying to work. Same, in the muscles used in jiu-jitsu, your adductors might have to be very strong, and it might not be something that's necessary for other athletes. But again, working as a physio, I really look at the patient and I look who comes to me, because sometimes if you give someone a complicated move, and it might be something that I think it's quite simple, if you give it to them and they don't do it well, they come back in 2 weeks and they haven't done the exercise well because they forgot how to do it. There's too many cues, or it's a skill that's too complicated to learn, and they don't actually get the benefit, and we can't move on and improve. So I think if it's someone who's just started, keep it relatively simple and don't confuse the specifics. Don't confuse of what it is you're trying to work. Be specific in your ranges, but you don't have to recreate jiu-jitsu movement with a weight.
Yeah, Liv, I think that point at the end is the key thing. This topic of specificity is probably like, if you were going to do a master's in strength and conditioning, you'd probably spend a whole semester or something discussing this topic. You could go on about it forever. As a recreational athlete or someone coming to the sport, when you think about it being specific, you're probably thinking about incorporating jiu-jitsu movements into your strength and conditioning. That's probably what you're thinking about straight away. And what I will say there is that is a type of activity called a specific strength exercise. Okay, you see them a lot in certain types of sports, and in some sports they're more important than in others. I'm not saying that you can't do them. What I'm saying is that when you start out as a practitioner, as someone trying to train S&C for jiu-jitsu, you don't need to do that stuff. It isn't going to give you the return that you want quickly. I'm not saying you can't use it in certain circumstances, because it can be useful, but I would start off by doing the basic things. If you look at high performance athletes, the two things that they do is, one is all high performance athletes do the basics excellently, and that means developing strength through the ranges of motion that they need. The second thing that they do is they also work on what we call marginal gains, so the small areas that will give them that advantage over their competitors. As a recreational athlete, you're not going to get to those small advantages because you're only training 3 times a week, let's say, for jiu-jitsu. So what you want to do is do the fundamentals really good, which means that after you've been doing S&C for a couple of years, you want to look like you go into the gym, you know exactly what you're doing, you're doing good technique, not that you're going to do some special exercise specifically for jiu-jitsu. And that's the mistake that people will make. They'll go, I'm doing jiu-jitsu, I need to do some very specific exercises, I need to maybe do some clever funky stuff with hip bridges, or I need to do some clever grip work, etc. Probably to start with, that's not what you need to do. Probably you just need to start with the simple stuff. Okay, so which is all the stuff, the compound exercises that Ben was talking about earlier. If you're going in and you're putting weight vests on and you're trying to replicate movement patterns from jiu-jitsu, just understand that sports like motor learning is very specific. So for example, shooting a basketball with a heavier basketball does not make you good at basketball. You know, the weight of the ball is very, very specific. People that are good at shooting, let's say a 10 kilogram ball into a basketball net are not the ones that are playing in the NBA, although you can get very good at that. Okay, it's the same with jiu-jitsu. If you're good at doing a sports jiu-jitsu skill with a weight vest on, doesn't mean you're going to be good at doing it without a weight vest on. So don't get caught in that trap. That would be the very first thing that I would say. Having said that, I'll be a little bit of a contrarian here, which is that imagine that you're a jiu-jitsu player training in the gi and you're training for 16 hours a week. Do you need to do additional grip training for that? The answer probably is probably not, because you're doing 16 hours of basically gripping the gi all the time. If you were to add strength training exercises for your grip strength on top of that, you'd probably overload your grip. Whereas if you're someone who's only training twice a week for jiu-jitsu, then I'm not saying you have to do this, but it may be useful to have additional grip strength training in your program, because then you're not doing enough grip strength to get stronger, so you need to increase a little bit there. Similarly with hip bridging, if you're a professional jiu-jitsu athlete and you're rolling again for, let's say, an hour a day, 7 days a week, that's 7 hours of rolling. You're going to do a lot of hip bridging there in that against resistance. So maybe you wouldn't necessarily need to overload that in your physical preparation program. Whereas if you're only training 2 days a week, and you had the opportunity to go home and do some work away from the mats, it might be useful to actually do a little bit of hip bridging activity, maybe with a little bit of load in there as well, because therefore you're increasing the amount of training you're doing without overloading that area. So this is where having a professional person come in and help and work with you can actually be very beneficial. I've seen, and probably Liv, you've seen this, a lot of people that think, let's say I'm a rock climber, so I'm going to train my grip as well as doing rock climbing, and then they overload their fingers, and then they end up with serious injuries that are very, very difficult to improve. It's all about balancing all those little things together, and with specificity, this is an important factor to consider. Now, if we were talking for the S&C coaches, there's lots of other details that we can go into, but maybe in a future podcast, me and Ben can go over a little bit more about specificity there. But this is enough now. For us to know in terms of this discussion.
So Ben, another question was, how often should I change what I'm doing? So how often should they change the stimulus or the program?
One of the key principles of any strength and conditioning program will be variation. So if you do the same, adaptation is simply you adapt to what you're given. So if you start a program, there'll be a certain period where you decrease, but then that'll start to feel normal. So you either have to increase something in the program, or you'll just remain at that same state. So variation is a natural occurrence within any training program. The two big considerations I would take in terms of changing your program, because what is common, I think, is changing things every week after week after week, or doing things kind of as they feel or what they see fit. Or if there's a new exercise they've seen on Instagram or online, they'll start doing that. So the more that you vary things around, perhaps the less adaptation you're getting, because your body's feeling so many different things, it can't necessarily hold on to one thing and adapt to it. So the two considerations that I would take is, one, be practical and look at your competition schedule. When are you competing? Plan around, trips, holidays, etc. And what are your windows? Like maybe there's a big open mat that your club has coming up. So that's maybe a chance that you can flip your program around, or maybe there's an event that's being held, or maybe there's a competition. So plan your windows of opportunity and see what your program can run until, because I think holding on to a program and just making steady progress over a long period of time certainly can be more powerful than flipping your program every week or every 2 weeks. I guess then from a physical perspective, it depends on the person. And on what kind of phase that you're looking at. But certainly 4 to 5 weeks is advisable to change your program. And you could probably get away with, extending that out to up to 8 to 10 weeks, as long as there's some element of progressive overload in the program. So every week or every 2 weeks, there's some sort of progression happening. Again, it depends on the person. But yeah, I'd probably be looking around every month is probably quite simple to change. Or every 2 months. So practically, that's where I had the one other consideration I would have is the less trained the person, the less they need to change the program. If they're just starting out, it's the very basics, I would almost hand them, and I've done this with a couple of my junior athletes now, is here's a template program. The only thing that you're going to change on this is making the weights heavier, and let's just do that until it stops happening. So there's a couple of programs out there that build that principle in, you know, like a 1x20 program or an APRE program. But certainly I would be more inclined for a less trained athlete to give them something simple and repeatable for a very long time. And that might be, you know, a year and a half worth, but you will see exponential gains. But yeah, as with anything in strength and conditioning and training, it depends. Do you have any thoughts on that, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you there, especially about the less trained person. Look, again, this is a difference between training specifically for something like jiu-jitsu versus training because you wanna look good, etc. If you go to a commercial gym, one of the key things that they want to do is they want to keep you engaged, right? And it's also important psychologically for you to stay engaged. So if you go to a commercial gym, you'll probably see that they'll often change your exercises quite a lot. And that's because they want to keep it interesting for you. They want to keep you coming back, etc. If that isn't a factor, which probably it isn't so much, then you can just stay with the same exercises for a long period of time. And exactly what you said, actually, when I very first started strength training, there was there was some stuff that happened right at the beginning because I wasn't sure exactly what I was doing. When I first started strength training, I found a program that I thought made sense to me and did make sense to me at the time. And I stuck with that basic program for almost 16 months. And all I did was I increased the amount of weight that I could lift in the main exercise that we're doing. Sometimes I changed the exercises slightly, but not a huge amount. And essentially what happened there was I'll give you an example in my deadlift. I went from starting off, I remember the very first time I ever did a deadlift, I lifted about 60 kilograms for 12 reps. And I found that incredibly difficult. And then all I did was I added 0.125 of a kilogram pretty much per session for those 16 months. And I got to the point where at the end, I was doing 20 single reps at 160 kilograms. And that was just adaptation over a course of 16 months. And I went from being relatively weak to being extremely strong in that 16-month period. And I didn't really change anything at all. You know, sometimes I changed the foot positioning on squats, for example. Sometimes I changed the hand positioning on bench press. But nothing else changed throughout the program. And I had amazing gains, amazing physiological changes to myself. You know, I went from being maybe 68 kilograms to being close to 80 kilograms. And all of that came about through, probably most of it came about through muscle mass gains and through strength gains. And that was because the age that I was and the fact that I progressively overloaded. So you don't have to change your session very often. Having said that, of course, people will get bored and you can change. My advice would be it takes, based on my experience, it takes most people 16 to 32 sessions to achieve adaptation to something. So if you're training 3 times a week, 16 sessions is about 5 to 6 weeks, okay? So probably, every 4 to 6 weeks will be when you're going to change at the minimum, is what I would suggest. Anything above that would probably be for psychological reasons more than anything else. So that would be my suggestions. And I think this makes sense, and it makes your life quite easy because you can get a training program, you can stick with it for 1 month, 2 months, and then you can switch to something else, and you can progress through like that. And that would be my key advice, especially for a recreational athlete. When you're an elite athlete, there are some other things that we would talk about in terms of planning, in terms of when in the year you're going to be and when your competitions are, and therefore you're going to change to make sure you have the energy required to prepare for competition rather than the energy required to lift heavier weights or whatever it is. But for the recreational athlete, if you changed your program every 1 month to 2 months, I think that would make perfect sense.
So now that we've talked about a lot of things you can do, what are some of the biggest mistakes you can make when training strength and conditioning? I might let Ben answer that first.
Sure. So I think the biggest mistake that you'll see with any strength and conditioning program applied to a sporting context, but particularly say in jiu-jitsu, is losing sight of the main goal. So the main goal is to be better at jiu-jitsu and applying this new strength and conditioning program, and all of a sudden, like you're seeing good gains and all of a sudden becomes your main focus. Perhaps it's not at the benefit of your jiu-jitsu training. And maybe it's an area of training that you want to follow up and you look at more weightlifting and powerlifting, that's fine. But then your goal is changing. So losing sight of the main goal is probably the biggest thing, and making the main thing the main thing. It is difficult to manage, but that's where you've got to kind of play that card right. The second big mistake is, and you'll see later on, we'll go through some of the programs that we wrote for Liv and how we applied them in a specific context. But that worked for Liv in her specific context. So just because we did it that way doesn't mean it was right or wrong for every jiu-jitsu athlete. So looking at any pro athlete and copying exactly what they do, just because they do it doesn't make it right for everyone. It just means that in their specific context, in their specific training environment, they're going to use that certain method. So, you know, on a practical level, there's some of the exercises we did with Liv due to equipment constraints, and there'll be other exercises that other athletes do just because they enjoy it, they like it, they think it's beneficial, but it's not a rule across everyone that everything works for everyone. Quite often you're copying a pro athlete's program that they'll have supplemented perhaps by a whole support team. They'll have, you know, physio and massage and nutritionists looking after them. So if you're applying that method or that training in your own environment, you're going to see some issues predictably. Tom, do you have any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I think it's exactly what you just said. I'll just bring up two different examples. The first thing is that, you know, you need to do what is good for you, which isn't necessarily what's good for somebody else, right? And also depending on where you are, whether or not this is the first time you started doing any kind of physical preparation in a weight room, for example, you know, these things you need to think about. And I'll give you two really good examples. One you just brought up would be copying the program of other athletes. The other thing is to copy training programs from other eras. So a classic thing, especially when you're S&C coach and you first start reading, you read all about all these amazing Eastern Bloc training methodologies, right? And you're like, wow, listen to these things. They sound fantastic. This is all science-based. It sounds like a great thing to do. And then you don't realize that their circumstances were very, very different. You know, they were working with athletes that had been training from when they were young, had good coaching, for example. They were very conditioned. There was also the fact that in the Eastern Bloc, there was a huge amount of steroid use. It was, it was ingrained into their system. And therefore, some of those methods, they're just not going to work when you apply them to a regular person in a Western setting with a job and all this other kind of stuff. So that would be the first thing. The second thing would be, again, for a similar reason, would be looking at, like, say, Instagram influencers or particularly bodybuilders. And again, you don't know the circumstances around some of those guys. So, you know, even if someone's saying they're not using steroids, they may be using steroids as an example, and therefore they're able to do a lot more training than you would be able to do it as an individual athlete. And this is actually the mistake that I made when I very first started strength training when I was 19 years old. So this was back in 1999. At the time, I was playing basketball, and I'm 180 tall, about that. And I was like, I'm not going to start strength training until I'm 19 years old because I don't want to stunt my growth. You know, that was my belief back then because I didn't know anything about it, right? So about 6 months before I turned 19, I started to research. I'm going to start doing strength training when I'm 19 because by that time, you know, hopefully my growth will have continued. I'm going to go and look up like how to train, right? And I went on the internet because we had the internet back then. It was one of the new things. And I went onto a website and I looked up some training programs, and I saw this. I wanted to put on some. I was doing it for sports performance, but also because I was a skinny kid. I was like 67 kilograms. I wanted to put some muscle on. I saw this guy that was this bodybuilder. I looked at his weight training program. It looked quite sensible, and he was huge. He was jacked, and I was like, wow, if I could get 10% of the muscle mass gains that this guy has got, then then I'll be really happy with that. So I looked at his training program. I took it. I went away and I tried to implement it myself. And of course, what I didn't realize at that time, because I'd never heard of anabolic steroids or anything else, is that this guy was taking anabolic steroids, and he was doing a training program that was just basically physically impossible for me to do. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something like 20 different exercises, 3 to 5 sets of each one. It was taking me like an hour and a half, 2 hours to complete. I'd never done any strength training before. You know, I was an athletic kid. I played basketball, did lots of jumping. You know, I could climb ropes, I could do all this stuff. I wasn't not strong. But what I found was after 6 months in this training program, I was weaker than I was when I started because I was doing overtraining. And I didn't actually realize that this was a thing. And so therefore I made a huge mistake. And I remember I was in the gym. I'd done all this research. I thought I knew exactly what I was doing. And I'd come in and I'd started off when I came in, being able to do 6 pull-ups or 8 pull-ups, what it was. And after 6 months, I was struggling to do 3 pull-ups because I was exhausted. And the guy that was like in the gym that, I knew him. He didn't necessarily have a great academic background. He turned around to me and he said, Tom, looks like you're pretty tired, I think you need to, I think you're overtrained, you need to stop. And I was like, oh my God, he's right. And I went back and I started to read about overtraining. I started to read about some other things, and I realized, wow, what I'm doing is crazy. And so I went from a training program where I was doing 20 sets of 4 to 5, 20 exercises of 4 to 5 sets per exercise, down to the next training program that I implemented, which literally was 4 different exercises: squat, bench, pull-ups, and a deadlift. and I was doing no more than 20 reps total in each exercise, and that was the training program that took me from deadlifting 60 kilograms to deadlifting 160 kilograms in the space of just around about 2 years. So I think this is like a huge mistake that people can make, and I think you need to be very careful about this. Be careful of gurus, be careful of people that are touting crazy training methods, because while they might look great on Instagram, that's not actually what you're doing. And if you go and look at an elite level athlete working in like an institute, let's say like the VIS or the EIS or anywhere else, their training programs are not super complicated, right? They're relatively straightforward, and they're very simple. And you'll see that when you see Liv's program later on. So that would be my key mistakes that I've made, and then also key mistakes I think people regularly make. Liv, have you got any other points to bring up?
I think you guys have really covered it all. I would probably just say it again, don't copy what pro athletes are doing, or really any other athlete for that matter. You don't know who's injured. You don't know who's actually using steroids. You don't know what their goals are. You also don't know how hard they're training. I certainly found that in the middle of my ADCC prep, doing the 3 programs was so exhausting for me. But now that I look at the programs and I have actually dug some of them up and done them in the sort of lockdown isolation time, they're not that hard when I'm not also training 5 hours a day of jiu-jitsu. That I was like, oh, how was I tired from that? But, if someone just tried to copy it, and they might have a full-time job and they're also training full-time, it will be close to impossible. And I think actually it's not a mistake. I would post nearly every one of my workouts on Instagram as a story, and I had pretty much 2 reasons for that. One of them was Ben coaching me over Instagram if we couldn't do a session together, and the other one was, as a physio, I wanted to actually show my patients that committing to a program equals results. So it never, like, people always say, oh, but you're an athlete, or you're strong, or you've got this and that. No, it was actually like years and years of actual consistent work, and the takeaway message from that is, don't quit after 2 weeks. You're not going to see results after 2 weeks. You actually have to make it a long-term goal and commit to it, and don't just copy whoever you might be looking up on Instagram without reasoning behind it. But I think, to summarize it, the big mistakes are don't lose sight of the main goal, which should be jiu-jitsu, because that's what we're talking about, or whatever your sport is. Don't look at the pro athletes and copy. Don't look at the old Eastern European bloc or the bodybuilders who might have been using steroids or might be using steroids.
Absolutely. And I think like this brings us to like the conclusion of most of the key questions that were asked, but I think we should finish off by giving some practical tips to people who are recreational jiu-jitsu players who want to include S&C in their program. So Ben, maybe you could just start off by giving your kind of top tips for people.
Sure. I think and this is not to toot my own horn, but get a coach, getting an S&C coach, getting a professional, and, be that whoever it is, if they have good credentials, they have a good history of working with athletes and developing them and shown good results, then hire them, pay them for their program, pay them for their expertise. Because I think the benefits, as we've discussed throughout, they're going to be able to apply a program in your specific context, help you with technique. And ideally, the way I see it, it's like a driving instructor. Is once you get a really good understanding of that yourself, you might be able to take that and go by yourself. You're not going to have your driving instructor in your car for the rest of your life. So, you eventually going to be able to go on. And if you've learnt enough with your S&C coach, maybe you can go and write your own program or understand the basics and go and apply them in your own context. So, first thing first, obviously, get a coach, learn the basics, learn the technique, and learn as much as you can about physical training, because that's going to set you up in a really good stead in the long term. Some more practical advice would be do a warm-up before any jiu-jitsu session. So include some S&C exercises in that. It doesn't have to be super heavy or super hard, but maybe, as we've said, do some mobility before you start training, do some jumping around, get your body and joints warm and ready before you go into drilling or competition. And that's where, as a third point, you can sneak in some additional exercises. If you do a really good warm-up every single time you've trained, you've accumulated a certain amount of hours over the course of a year that you otherwise wouldn't have. Or do them just straight after you train. Do them as a cool down as such, but you can extend that out for as long as you like. As I said, it's a cool down, it's after the main thing. So be practical about how you train and apply it specifically. Liv, do you have any tips?
Yeah, the biggest one for me would be to stay consistent and persistent with your strength and conditioning, whatever your goals are for that. You definitely have to put in the time, you have to put in the effort, and it takes a long time. Just like any other training, Jiu-Jitsu is exactly the same. I think what helps me practically is if I decide to do my rehab, it's often, or I'm talking rehab because this is my physio perspective. It's not often the most exciting thing to do, but I think it's in my head, it's not negotiable. So if you make your time in the calendar, you block it out and you make it non-negotiable, and you just go and do it no matter how you feel. Of course, if you have to, emergencies happen, you have things come up, and if you do have to skip a session, I would say probably skip strength and conditioning and still go to jiu-jitsu if you had to choose. I think, again, concentrate on what's most important, and the jiu-jitsu skill is probably going to get you there first. And another one from an injury perspective is kind of what Ben was already saying. Make your rehab, if you don't have time, make it incidental exercise. For example, I do my single leg stands, balance, proprioception exercising when Lockie's explaining technique on the mats. It's pretty boring to stand on one leg and wave your arms around as rehab 10 times a day. So I do it, when Lockie's explaining technique, or if I'm going to get a coffee and there's a red light, I'll stand on one leg, or I'll do some calf raises or whatever it might be, just to save some time. And the other big thing would be especially if you're new to the sport, be careful of lifting heavy, whether it's squats or deadlifts or any other big lift that you're doing. And then straight after that, going and doing jiu-jitsu, where you might be inverting and putting a high stress, high compressive load on the spine. I think a lot of injuries can be caused with loading your spine in one way, which might be a deadlift, and then putting it into full flexion and having a completely different load the next hour, or even within the same day. So just like any other body part, your spine and your discs need actually time to adjust to the load. And if you're giving it two completely different sets of stimuli, they can actually, it can sort of break down and break a little bit more faster, I guess, or not have enough time to adapt. But yeah, they're probably my biggest tips. And what about you, Tom?
Yeah, so if I want to I'll give some practical tips around something a little bit different to what you've done, which is expectations of what you actually need to do as a recreational athlete. To be honest, these are probably kind of similar to what you would do as a performance athlete as well, but it doesn't have to be a 90-minute, 2-hour training session, okay? Ben's already talked about the fact that you can break it down, do things before and after training. But if you were just doing a pure physical preparation workout, I would say that workout should be no more than 1 hour long, okay? And if you were to break it down, it would look something like this. Somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes of warm-up, which could include some mobility work. I think very important, specifically for the spine. It could include upper, mid, and lower back mobility type workout. Then you're probably going to want to spend around about 40 minutes for your main session. Okay, if you're going much more than 40 minutes, then you're probably going to start getting tired from doing the session, and you're probably not working fast enough through it. It's going to be a waste of your time. If you come and see my athletes do a session, they won't last 40 minutes, they'll last 90 minutes, but the reality is we're taking 3 or 4, maybe even 5 minutes between different lifts. So that's a huge amount of time spent resting, essentially. And if you're not going to be lifting absolutely crazy amounts of weight, you probably don't need this extra rest. So I would restrict your main session to around about 40 minutes, but do 40 minutes of focused training. Then I would finish with between 5 and 10 minutes of mobility or some kind of recovery exercise at the end as well. And I think that those 3 elements, having a warm-up, having a main session, having a mobility, will bring your session together, and all of that shouldn't last more than an hour would be my suggestion there, okay? So a couple of other practical tips that you can use. In order to make sure that you continue to go through your program, there's a couple of things I like to do. One is there's a great iPhone app, probably available for Android as well, called Seconds. And there's in this program, it has a timer on it, and so you can write your training program into this, and you can go to the gym, and you can press start, and it will tell you, okay, 3 minutes for warm up. Then it can tell you the next exercise that you can put in yourself, and you can go through these. I personally use this myself when I'm working out because I want to make sure that I get in and out of that gym within an hour. I don't want to end up taking my training session being 90 minutes or whatever else. And I found since I've started doing this, I've been much more focused, and it's quite a nice way of going through and use it. So I'll put a link to that in the description for this video so you can see the Seconds Pro app. The final thing that I would say as well is, remember, you are doing physical preparation to enhance your jiu-jitsu. And because you are working as a recreational athlete, you don't necessarily want to put yourself at super risk. So and I do this even with my performance athletes, but I would say you want to keep a buffer, okay? When I say a buffer, what I mean is, if you are physically capable of lifting 100 kilograms in a squat in training, as a recreational athlete, as someone that's not training for the Olympic Games or to be for a big competition, etc., you don't necessarily have to go to that 100 kilograms. Give yourself a 10 kilogram buffer. You don't need to lift more than, let's say, 90 kilograms in the back squat in training. That last 10 kilograms, that's the buffer to give you a bit of safety. Okay, so I would suggest also implementing a buffer. Generally, when you train, you don't have to, especially if you're doing other training sessions, you don't have to work. You don't have to kill yourself every single session. If you're just training to look good, and you're training 3 times a week to look good, that means you have 4 days to recover. So feel free to kill yourself those 3 sessions. Whereas if you're doing 3 sessions of jiu-jitsu, then 3 S&C sessions, you shouldn't be absolutely 100% dead at the end of all those sessions. Because if you are, over time, over 4 or 5 weeks, you're probably not going to recover fully. So keep some kind of buffer in your training. And don't think just because you're not dying every single session, you're not getting something from it. I would say in the long run, as Liv said, it's better to be consistent and not get injured and not get overtrained than it is to overtrain, have short-term gains, but then have to take a few weeks or even months off training because you got injured, because you were too tired or you were overdoing things. So those would be my key practical tips. I think if you follow those, you'll be in good stead in terms of implementing physical preparation into your training program.
One more thing I'd like to bring up as well is recording and monitoring what you're actually doing. So definitely write down your program or what you've done at the gym, write down when you've done your jiu-jitsu sessions, and maybe just a quick note on how you feel, or especially on the days where you might be getting really tired or injured. It will not only give you a really good way to recognize your patterns where, you might look back and go, oh, I was training really hard for 3 days in a row and then I got injured. And you might actually start seeing patterns and knowing yourself more. And the other one would be to give it to, if you do decide to work with a specialist coach or a physiotherapist or whoever it might be, to actually show them what you've done so they have something to work with as well, because it is sometimes really hard for people to recall exactly what happened at what time. So that's another practical tip you can use.
So once again, I think we've come to the end of our discussion, and now it's time to summarize the take-home messages. The first topic we discussed is how specific you need to get in what you're doing in the gym in order for it to translate to performance in jiu-jitsu. And here the key take-home message is that you don't necessarily need to replicate sports movement patterns in order to get a benefit. Especially when it comes to developing strength, the more complicated the movement pattern, the lower the external load that can be applied. And this is why strength training exercises tend to be really simple. Think about things like squats, deadlift, pull-up, bench press. They're all simple movements that don't replicate sports movement patterns that you normally see. So instead of focusing on training with sports-specific movement patterns in the gym, instead what you should be looking at is developing the underpinning qualities and body parts involved. For example, make sure you use the range of motion that you need. Focus on the type of muscle contractions involved in the sport, and also the magnitude of the forces involved. Also, it's important to recognize that there are some times of the year, which is usually close to competition or grading, etc., when you want to be more specific in your physical preparation than others. Similarly, how specific you get might change over time as you go from being a novice through to being someone who is more experienced. The second topic we looked at is how often we should change our training program. And here the panel were in consensus that you probably don't need to change the program more than once every month. Anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks usually makes sense. When starting out as a novice in strength conditioning, variation is less important than for someone who's been doing strength conditioning for a long time. And rather than changing the exercise all the time, the main thing really is to look to have some kind of progressive overload in your training. So this might mean increasing the weight slightly every 2 weeks or so. When it comes to big mistakes that people often make, the first one is to lose sight of what the main goal is, which is to improve jiu-jitsu, and instead let strength and conditioning become an end into itself. The second is to blindly copy what pro athletes, bodybuilders and influencers are doing. Remember, their needs and constraints might not necessarily be the same as yours, so what you might need to do might be completely different from what they're doing. We finished off the episode with some practical tips. The first one was to get a coach, at least until you feel confident. The second was to be consistent and persistent with your training. Block out time in your diary and just do it. And the third was to be careful when doing heavy squats and deadlifts and then going straight into jiu-jitsu and inverting, because you could potentially be putting your spine at risk. In terms of training expectations, for most recreational grapplers, we'd recommend training physical preparation 2 to 3 times a week for no more than an hour in each session. And that session will probably be broken down to something like 5 minutes of warm-up, 45 minutes of the main session, and then roughly 10 minutes of cool down time. And consider using a timer to keep yourself on track during the workout. So hopefully you enjoyed this discussion, and we'll tune in next time when we switch our focus to S&C for the competitive grappler. As always, let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and remember to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you get notifications whenever Liv and Lockie release new content. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.